Hello everybody, welcome to today's video. My name is Imo David, and today I'm going to show you how to start a podcast from your home. How to start a podcast from your home. I've gotten a lot of questions from people asking me how can they start a podcast from their home. In this video today, I'm going to explain everything that you need to know about starting a podcast from your home. And this video is divided into three parts: part one, part two, and part three. Now let's get straight into the video. We're going to start with what is a podcast. A podcast is a digital audio or a video series that you listen to over the internet. Sometimes this audio or video series can contain episodes, can contain episodes, topics, live section, and other stuff. It's just something you listen to, something you listen to. Now let's get down to the forms of podcast. There are two types of podcast. You have the video podcast, and then we have the audio podcast. For example, video podcast like The Honest Bunch is a video podcast. The Sparkle Echo podcast is the podcast I'm working on. And then we have audio podcasts which are available on Audio Mac, Spotify, and other platforms. Now, let's get down to things to do before starting the podcast. This is the most important section. This is the most important section of starting a podcast. Okay, what do I need to do before starting the podcast? What do I need to do before starting the podcast? Now, the first thing you need to do is to define your podcast concept. You need to define your podcast concept. What the podcast concept means is define your theme. Define your theme. What do you want to talk about? Are you talking about what is your theme of your podcast? Are you talking for podcast about pregnancy? Are you talking about podcast for Christians, for married people, and other stuff? And then find your area of interest. Now, this area of interest is very, very important because most times when people start podcasts, they don't have an area of interest. So they can quickly go on out of topics, they can quickly run out of points, run out of episode and other stuff. So you need to find your area of interest. Now, the third thing you need to know under define your podcast concept is your target audience. This is very important. You can't be making podcasts which is meant for married people and expecting young people to watch it, which is not bad. But your podcast, your target audience is very important in when you're launching your podcast. Very important. So you need to define your podcast concept before starting your podcast. Now, the next thing you need to do is to plan your episodes. This is very important. I tell people starting a podcast that if you are not able to plan 10 topics, 5 to 10 topics of a podcast, then don't start it. Yes, if you're not able to plan 5 to 10 topics of a podcast, then don't start it. Now, let's go under planning your episode. Now, the first thing you need to do is to create a list of potential topics. It's still part of planning it. Create a list of potential topics. You need to have like 5 to 10 topics under that theme you are picking for your podcast. Under that theme, you need to have like 5 to 10 topics under that theme. And the next thing you need to do is to find out how many minutes is your podcast. Do you want the podcast to run for 10 minutes? Do you want the podcast to run for 15 minutes? Do you want your podcast to run for 1 hour, depending on what you want to do? And the next other thing I didn't add to this list is to know how many people do you want to be on a podcast. Remember, this is starting a podcast from your home. So you should not have more than 2 people on your podcast. You or your husband, you or your brother, you or your friend. Just 2 people so that you don't have to go out of technicality in the next video. So these are the 3 points in part 1 of this. What is podcast? Forms of podcast. We have video podcast. We have audio podcast. So I'm going to show you in the next videos on how you can get these 2 without recording separate videos. I'm going to show you that one, and I've shown you things to do before starting the podcast. These are just the 2 ones. We're going to continue these points in the next video.